I do believe that Ayn Rand did not solve the problem of ethics, did not figure out how to get the ought from the is, right? So the central problem was identified by David Hume in the 18th century. He was a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher and a chunky fellow. Central problem that was identified by David Hume was that you cannot get a should from an is. You can't get an ought from an is, right? Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. If an organism fails in that action, it dies. Its chemical elements remain, but its life goes out of existence. It is only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible. It is only to a living entity that things can be good or evil. I think that's a leap.
I have to disagree. To put it mildly, it would be a leap to believe that good and evil mean anything to a dead person. Likewise, nothing can be of value to a dead man or a dead entity. Good and value have no meaning except to a living human being. And that's why in Rand's philosophy, one's own life is one's own highest value. It's the primary value. You cannot have any other value unless you're first alive.
Here's the challenge, I think, that's in Ayn Rand. So man has no automatic code of survival, says Ayn Rand, which raises the need to think and to reason, which is great. But then she says that the immoral or irrational people are only capable of pain, which means that human beings do have an inbuilt knowledge of what to do, right? But if human beings don't have any instincts which tell them right from wrong, why would somebody doing wrong be capable of nothing but pain? That's a total contradiction, and it's a pretty core contradiction.
There's no contradiction there. You say that if man has no instincts, then he needs rationality in order to be happy. Fine. It does not logically follow that in the absence of rationality, you need an instinct in order to find unhappiness or to find pain. All you have to do to experience pain is, for example, sit on a beach, think nothing, have no instincts, and eventually you will suffer pain, the pain of hunger. Pain is a default. Suffering is the default of not choosing to live, not choosing to think. You don't have to go looking for it. It comes for you. All right? That's the point of her philosophy. You don't need an instinct to find pain. It finds you as a matter of natural course. It's the natural course of death. Pain and death are the default occurrence. That's what happens when you don't choose rational pursuit of life and happiness. By default, you suffer and you die. That's the whole point of her philosophy.
As far as metaphysics go, the nature of reality, epistemology, the nature of knowledge, the methodology for determining truth and falsehood, I'm a complete slave to the Rand. So my primary issue with objectivism is not in terms of metaphysics, not in terms of epistemology. So nature of reality, the axiom that existence exists, all seems perfectly sensible to me, and forms the basis of my own particular take on the problems of ethics and politics. She writes, happiness is that state of consciousness which proceeds from the achievement of one's values. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. I think happiness is a state of consciousness which proceeds with integrity to rationality and reality for reasons that I've talked about elsewhere.
I don't know how you can square your statement on the one hand that you agree with Rand's metaphysics and epistemology, but on the other hand you're saying that happiness is a precursor to rationality and reality. If you believe that, if that's your philosophy, that's entirely contrary to Rand's metaphysics and epistemology. Now maybe it's just the way you're wording it and the way I'm understanding it, but otherwise I really don't see how you agree with her at all. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, you're inverting the entire pyramid as far as I'm concerned in terms of her belief that emotion was the result of, it comes after cognition.
I don't think that we can really say that happiness results from the achievement of one's values, because if my value is, say, to be a published author, and I don't achieve that because society is corrupt or I just never find the right agent, then should I be unhappy? Well, whether I get published or not is outside of my control. Right? Whether I have integrity and virtue in my own personal relationships, in my own life, my relationship with myself and reality, that I have control over.
I can only assume that that's why you think that experiencing pain requires some kind of instinct. You appear to be looking for a way to guarantee happiness simply by thinking and acting in the right way, by doing what you can with the things that you can control. But that's not what Ayn Rand's philosophy proposes. I would suggest that to seek, this code of ethics in which happiness is guaranteed, your happiness is guaranteed, is to overlook the fact that you cannot control the metaphysically given. The metaphysically given does have an impact on whether you're going to be happy or not, and you don't control the metaphysically given. All you can do is try and increase the odds that you'll achieve happiness by following a rational course of action. Rand even points out in her philosophy that rationality is not a guarantee of happiness. She quite openly says that even if you conduct yourself rationally, that's no guarantee that you will achieve a given value, and without achieving that value, you aren't going to be happy at having achieved that value. So happiness is dependent upon the achievement of values, but rationality is not the only thing that affects whether or not you're successful.
When you're a philosopher, you have to say to people, why should you be good? The question is, how do you deal with people who have no conscience, right? The real challenge is dealing with the sociopaths, right? Dealing with the sociopaths. And that's, of course, my sticking point in the way that I've tried to solve issues in terms of ethics.
When you're a philosopher, you don't need to ask, why should you be good? You need to ask, why should I be good? Philosophy is a discovery for how to run one's own life, not of how to convince others to run theirs. You say that the real problem is sociopaths. You say that they don't feel pain, so they don't change. In effect, you're saying that the job of a philosopher is to try and come up with a way to convince sociopaths not to be sociopathic, to convince the irrational not to be irrational, but to accept rationality as a mode of life, or the only way to live. It can't rationally be the standard by which a philosophy is judged. The job of a philosopher is not to convince irrational people to be rational. The job of a philosopher is to discover what is true about the facts of reality, how he knows it, and how he should live given the facts of nature, given the facts of reality. It's not about proving to the irrational that you're right about the facts of reality, or about the way in which people know the facts of reality, or about how you should live. If the irrational want to die, that doesn't mean that your philosophy is wrong. If the irrational refuse to act in ways that allow them to live, that's not a reflection on your philosophy. That's a reflection on their own minds and on themselves, on their own philosophy. The possibility that an irrational person might never cease to be irrational, that an irrational person might not agree with Rand, does not mean that Rand's philosophy is therefore flawed. You don't judge a philosophy's soundness by, whether Charles Manson agrees with it or agrees to live by it.
Sociopaths don't change their behavior because they don't experience pain. They experience a flush of power and of dominance at a purely base biological level. What is it? George Bush obviously enjoys the exercise of power, ran for re-election, is not giving it up, so he's not experiencing pain. In fact, he's experiencing pleasure through the exercise of power. The pain and pleasure principle is not a basis for ethics. Right? It makes them subjective. Right? So again, this is a challenge, I think, in the Randian ethics at its sort of particular base.
Your criticism of pain and pleasure not being the basis for morality is sound. But it's also true that it was not the basis for Rand's system either. Rand did not base her system of ethics on pain and pleasure. She based it on life and death. Rand distinguishes between pleasure on the one hand and happiness on the other. I don't think you've made that distinction, or at least you haven't recognized it, or I'm not sure, but it doesn't seem throughout your video that you're recognizing that distinction. To Rand, pleasure is a sensation. It can be experienced whether you're rational or irrational. Two people having sex can have great, feelings, great sensations, even if they totally lack any happiness in the sexual act. Pleasure is a matter of the senses. Happiness, as Rand defines it, is a matter of cognition. It's an emotion. It's the result of what you think and how you act and how you experience the world as a result. It's not, the bare sensations of a thrill or the rush of adrenaline or the great feeling of having one's hair stroked or something. Sensation is one thing, cognition is another. Pleasure is one thing, happiness is another. I think you're confusing purpose and value. In Rand's system of ethics, one's highest value is life, not happiness. And one's highest purpose is happiness, not life. It's not the case that Rand has a hedonistic system. A hedonistic system would say the highest value is pleasure or happiness or something along those lines. Probably pleasure, not happiness. But Rand is not saying that. Rand is saying life is the highest value, happiness the purpose. So to critique her system as though she's saying that, pain and pleasure are the basis for right and wrong is false. It's not warranted. That's not what she says anywhere in her books. It's not a criticism of her philosophy.
No, you do not have to live. It is your basic act of choice. But if you choose to live, you must live as a man by the work and judgment of your mind. Well, I guess that's true, but the work and judgment of your mind might be to dominate all those around you and steal their stuff, right? Which is what some people love to do. It makes them very happy, right? And again, this is the challenge that philosophers face, that evil people do very well. Genghis Khan, Saddam Hussein, he died, he was hung, and Hitler killed himself, but they obviously preferred the life that they had, right? Saddam Hussein lived in palaces, he had free run of the entire country, he got to do whatever he wanted. So evil sociopaths do a lot better.
A dictator, no doubt, feels a great deal of pleasure. They may kill someone and feel a great rush of adrenaline, a sense of power. They may feel pleasure. That's not the same as being happy. This isn't about looking for Freudian this or Freudian that, as you're referring to in your video. This is a simple distinction between sensation on the one hand and cognition on the other. It's widely acknowledged. It's in psychology, in philosophy, those two things are entirely different matters. One is largely automatic and sensory, autonomic process if you want. The other is a product of cognition. The fact that Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler or any of these folks experience pleasure does not mean, maybe because they're driving around in a car and they like the feeling of their leather seat or the smell of their cigar or whatever, they're all very pleasurable things. That doesn't mean they're happy. When we're talking about happiness, we're talking about the achievement of values. That's what Rand is referring to by the word happiness. If you want to equate pleasure and happiness, then you're in fact folding together the cognitive and the sensory. And that's a distinction that Rand made and that you would not be making if that's what you're doing.
She says, no, you do not have to live as a man. It is an act of moral choice, but you cannot live as anything else. But that's not true even within her own writing, right? So the bad people they have generations. She talks about generations of the moochers that lead to the catastrophes in the novel Atlas Shrugged, but they all did very well. Thank you very much, right?
Now at this point in your video, you leave one with the impression that perhaps you haven't even read Atlas Shrugged. I don't mean that to be rude. I'm sure you have read it. I mean, you're reading a speech right from the book. The Galt speech is from Atlas Shrugged. But a dictator does not, despite doing very well, quote unquote, or feeling all kinds of pleasure, does not achieve any values at all. Not by being a dictator, not by enslaving others, not by stealing their property. That is not the achievement of values. That's the whole point of the book. The point of Atlas Shrugged was to demonstrate that these people who are doing quite well, thank you, who are experiencing pleasure as heads of train companies and etc., but are not acting rationally, are acting emotionally or acting by social climbing and etc. The point of the book is to show that they are not achieving anything at all and that their lives depend entirely upon the rationality and productiveness of others. And the point of the story was, look what happens when the productive, when the rational withdraw their services from the rest of society, from irrational society. Their very survival at that point is at risk. They're likely to die unless they become rational, unless they start to act rational themselves. The dictators that you speak about are not people who are achieving values. They are people who are looting or mooching those values from others, as are any other irrational folks. People who try to get by on mooching and looting in many other ways. Social climbing and other social metaphysicians. Those are not people who are achieving values, even if they're doing very well, quote unquote. It does not mean they're achieving values. They might be sensing pleasure. It does not mean they're achieving happiness. The life of a dictator or other irrational person is entirely dependent upon the lives and productivity of rational people. Apart from being human, they aren't really even man. They are more parasite. If they weren't human, we would call them parasitical. We would call them parasites. A person who chooses not to think is choosing to let other people's decisions be the determinant of whether or not he lives or dies. He's choosing to live as a baby or as a kept animal, but he's not choosing to live. He's choosing to let other people decide whether or not to let him live. The only thing that will allow such a person to continue living is the sanction of his victims. The whole point of Atlas Shrugged was, what happens when they no longer sanction their own victimization? What happens when they shrug off that role that's been imposed upon them by those who refuse to think to themselves? The point of Atlas Shrugged is that if people around this dictator or around these irrational people decide suddenly to be thoroughly rational and moral, they'll withdraw their services. They won't allow their property to be taken. They won't allow their lives to be, or their liberty to be restrained. They won't allow their lives to be taken. They'll go away. They'll shrug. They'll withdraw their services. If the irrational, if the sociopaths attempt to take life, liberty, and property from those who are trying to withdraw it, if they try to take it by force, if they try to take those things by force, the response from a rational person is not verbal, it's ballistic. Force, defensive physical force, is the righteous response to a sociopath. We don't judge our philosophy by whether that sociopath responds to, moral words. And we aren't required to hand over our life, liberty, and property simply because that person doesn't understand or doesn't want to agree that our philosophy is sound. If they don't want to live a rational life, if they choose to try to live by being parasitical on the rational, there's only one solution in a rational world. They die. As for the stuff you say at the end of the video, I thought it was beneath you. I thought you were sinking to the level of several libertarians and anarchists and etc. And it was totally out of step with the rest of your video. But I will say this. If you were working with others to try and educate others as to your philosophy, and if you discovered that those others who were supposed to be working with you were misrepresenting your philosophy and passing it off as though it were your philosophy, perhaps because they want to pass off their own philosophy but call it your philosophy so that it will get this veneer of legitimacy because you've won through your good argument, you've won respect for your idea. And let's call your philosophy meism, and everyone thinks meism is great. Well, if your assistants in trying to educate the public are passing off some other philosophy as meism, you will publicly, if you're doing an effective job, you are going to publicly dissociate yourself from them, merely to protect your effort in trying to educate other people about your philosophy. If they go and attack you, if they do ad hominem attacks on you, say you're irrational, emotional, that you don't know what you're talking about, you're crazy, I'm sorry. You're going to dissociate yourself from them. You're not going to associate with them. Now, when you dissociate yourself from them, when you cast them out and you say, I'm not associated with them anymore, and they're certainly not associated with me or my ideas, are those who still agree with your ideas as you presented them fairly called cultists? That's effectively what you're saying. It's not very rational.